This is Obsessed with Assessment. I'm back. My name is Sam Denno, and I am the assessment lead at Twinkl and host of the podcast. Guess who else is back? It's not Emma Louise Rose McHale, my regular co-host, but James Beadle, Senior Professional Development Manager at the Assessment Network. James, you were so fabulous in the last episode that we had to get you back on. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's nice to be back.
On this show, we dissect educational assessment and examine its entrails. Our hope is that educators might be able to use our musings to embellish their own professional development, and that casual listeners will gather fascinating new insights into the world of school testing. And if you are a casual listener, then that seems very appropriate to this particular episode, because I've invited James back to talk about assessment literacy for all. Can you give us a 10-word tease for your pitch, James?
Yeah, go on then. Assessment literacy empowers and enables student ownership of their learning.
It's like you had that pre-prepared. Each episode, we aim to discuss an assessment concept for roughly 10 minutes before offering up some key takeaways for listeners to attempt to embed into their own practice. James, you use this term assessment literacy. Can you unpack what you mean by it?
Yeah. So firstly, I should probably confess that when I was a teacher, I wasn't really aware of this term. So, it's not necessarily a commonly used term within education, or at least not perhaps as common as I think it should be. So it's only really through my current profession and also further studying I've done that I've become familiar with it. And it's the idea that we should, I would say, be discussing with education this keen knowledge around assessments. And by we, I mean not just teachers, but students and parents and other key stakeholders. And the kind of knowledge we can be talking about here it can be very broad. So, talking about what makes a good assessment versus a bad assessment. Is it going to measure what we want it to measure? How should we interpret the results that the assessments give us? What does this score actually tell us? What can we infer from it? And ultimately, what can we do with these assessments to improve future learning? And perhaps that sounds simple, but I think there's a lot really to unpack there. And one of the complexities around assessment literacy is the kind of key things that you would view stakeholders need to know about assessments will change between different contexts. So for students within England at the primary level ages 5 to 11, you might expect parents, or you might want to help enable parents to really understand the SATs results. Why do we get this score that's kind of based around 100, and what does it mean? What's the difference, say, between a score of 105 and 110, or 95 and 90? I think that's quite important for our stakeholders to be able to understand. Whereas at secondary, you probably want parents and students to be able to, understand the different routes they have available to them post 16, so A levels, BTECs, T levels, etc. But also, again, the different kind of assessment structures that lie behind them, because that probably will inform part of that choice. How are they going to be assessed, and how are those results going to be used for future opportunities they might want to explore? And relating to all of this are some of the big sort of fundamental questions we would look at within sort of assessment theory. So what are the different types of assessments? What assessments are best suited from what purposes? What kind of information can we even get from an assessment?
Is there evidence that assessment literacy has had a positive impact on teachers, pupils, parents, etc.?
So there's, I think, two ways you can look at this, and sort of from a teacher perspective, assessment literacy, I think, is often really about making informed decisions about your own practice. So it's not necessarily telling you what to do, but it's helping you decide what you want to do and why you want to do them. And a big part of that is then being able to justify those decisions to your key stakeholders. And so within that body of what we would perhaps refer to as assessment literacy, there's a huge volume of research. You can look at Hattie, you can look at Black and Williams, etc. And all of that establishing various things such as the importance of formative assessment and feedback. And again, lots of research done trying to quantify and qualify the impact those have had within education. But the concept of assessment literacy, as I said, isn't necessarily saying about what you should do. It's helping you make that decision. So helping teachers or schools decide, for example, things like, do we need to give a grade to each piece of work? If we're not going to do this, why are we not going to do this? How can we explain this to parents, to students, that some of our work may not be graded? Or even if we're moving towards a no written marking policy or a significant reduction in the amount of written marking we're doing, what is the research behind this, and how can we explain that to the other key stakeholders? And that's where assessment literacy comes in. There's also quite a bit of research now being done more at the university level at the moment that does look to establish, and it seems to be the case, that where you have students who are perhaps older, increasing their assessment literacy does actually seem to lead to greater outcomes on their part. And this relates to the idea that they tend to have just greater satisfaction within their courses and feel a greater sense of belonging and connectedness. And a colleague of mine at the Assessment Network, Dr. Simon Child, is engaged in a research project around parental assessment literacy and sort of looking at that area and perhaps what can be done in order to further promote it. But yeah, ultimately, I would say it's about this idea of empowering both students and parents, other key stakeholders, to understand and being able to use assessment results and engage in the discussion around assessments. And regardless of what your opinion is about the assessment system within England, or the assessment system wherever you live, what I think is very important is that all stakeholders, and that includes parents and students, are able to critically engage with these processes. So if you're having discussions, if you want to make considerations about things such as, should we reduce the number of examinations in a subject, or should we look to bring in coursework, what are the implications of these discussions? And that's where assessment literacy, I would say, comes in.
I've always been an advocate for the idea of explaining to a pupil, this is how distributed practice works, or retrieval practice, this is how it's working, these metacognitive tools. Do you think that's so that's sort of the sort of practice that you're advocating for here?
I think that's a big part for students in particular, is explaining to them why you are doing things. I think particularly as students get older, some of these discussions aren't necessarily simple discussions if you're wanting to explain the concept of retrieval practice in a way they can engage with. But yeah, I think it's something that maybe older primary students and certainly secondary students can engage with. Yeah, it's important to bring them along and convince them about why you're doing things, and particularly in the idea that then, if things like retrieval practice are going to be effective for them, it's likely something you might be looking for them to engage with outside of the lesson. And realistically, they're probably only going to change the ways they do things like revision independently studying if they believe it works. So you do need to convince them if you want them to change their behavior.
So would you recommend that teachers talk about it at the front of the classroom?
Yes, I think I would, with perhaps the proviso that I probably wouldn't recommend they use the term assessment literacy. I don't necessarily think that that's required or will bring students along on the journey. And as I've said, I think it is somewhat age dependent. I'd say with younger students, it's important explaining at a simple level just why they're doing the tasks they're doing. So, letting them know firstly that what they're doing is an assessment. Again, even if you're not using the word assessment, the aim of the task is it's helping them show you what they can do. And then that there's going to be sort of a follow-up on that. You're going to then help them improve, and then they're going to presumably try it again and do better. It's bringing them along on that journey, and that's really important. I mean, one of the things we do know is that one of the things that governs receptivity to feedback, so how likely students are to engage with and act on feedback, is their belief that it works for them. So based on their prior experiences within education, if they've engaged with feedback, has that led to a change in performance? Has it worked for them? Have they gotten better? And so showing them that kind of journey of learning and the role assessment plays in it, that you see if they can do it, you give them support based on what they've done, and then they do better, making them believe that works for them will really benefit them as they get older. I think more broadly with assessment literacy, that there is quite a lot of relatively recent research, and again, a lot of it's ongoing, but shows quite a strong link between school connectedness and higher attainment. And that's something that PISA are looking at internationally. So if students feel a sense of belonging within within their school, they tend to do better than students who don't. And assessment literacy plays a part of that. For students feeling belonging, it can be things like understanding how their predicted grades are calculated, what kind of assessments are they expected to use, what data does it generate, how do you use that data, who gets to see the data, what are you going to mention at parents' evening. All of these kind of things, if they feel they have a stake in it, they're more likely to feel connected and have that sense of ownership over their own learning.
You point towards Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve as an important facet of assessment literacy. What's that all about?
So this is a pretty old idea. It's from the 19th century, but again, replicated in a lot of studies since then. Uh, it's not particularly complex. It's basically that we forget things, and relatively even simple information we unfortunately forget pretty quickly. It depends on how complex the information is, but often, if you ask people to memorize a short list of 10 words, almost half of those might be gone by the next day, and it unfortunately trails off from there. And you can, if you take a step back, you can maybe understand why. I'm not sure what our lives would be like if we had perfect recall of everything we'd done over the last X years of our lives. It may not be an enjoyable experience if we could do that. So they are probably good reasons why we forget things. But ultimately, I would say it's the big question of education. If people remembered everything as soon as it was told to them, education would look very, very different and would be a very, very different process. Education exists because people forget things, and a lot of what we do as teachers isn't necessarily just giving the knowledge, it's helping students retain and retrieve that knowledge. That's really what learning is. And why I think this is a big part of assessment literacy is, I think, although this perhaps feels like something that's very obvious, I think it's something that often, again, students and parents and other key stakeholders, we often forget. If a student doesn't remember something that they were taught a week ago, it's very easy to blame students or to blame parents, to say that something wrong occurred, either a student wasn't concentrating or that there was a problem with the original teaching, the original instruction. And most of the time that probably isn't the case. It is just, well established, we do forget things. And really what education and learning and what we should be looking to be happening within our schools and our institutions is that idea of re-establishing the knowledge. That's what the focus should be. We shouldn't necessarily view it as a problem, either at a student, teacher, or school level, that someone has forgotten something. What we should be looking for instead is there the practice in place that they then have the chance to realize they've forgotten it, and then presumably the following intervention to realize what it is they've forgotten, to learn it again, and then inevitably down the line to then be checked again. Can you now remember this or not?
That's a great way to look at it. We've mentioned spaced practice or distributed practice on the show before, and you see this as another important component of assessment literacy. Can you remind us of how that works?
Yeah, so it is building on the work of Ebbinghaus, and it's the idea generally that, because forgetting is natural, you want to obviously get in that action that then firstly sees if you'd remembered something, and then if not, provides that knowledge again, provides that corrective step. But what a lot of research has shown, and this is the idea of space practice, is once that intervention occurs, the curve of forgettingness, the rate at which you forget, gets slower. So you remember a little bit more for a little bit longer. Unfortunately, again, it takes generally multiple repetitions before you get to the stage where you'll remember most of it for a long period of time. And then there's a lot of research about, exactly what should that spacing look like. And yeah, some of the theories suggest that if you want people to retain things for longer, you actually want slightly longer space gaps between it. But I would say the biggest takeaway for students and for parents is to realize that, teaching isn't necessarily modular. It's not a case of, right, you learn something in September, something new in October, something new in November, etc., etc. You learn something in September, you might then need to revisit it in October. You might need to be retaught a lot of it again. You might then revisit in November. You might need to be retaught a little bit again. December still knocks up. We check again in February. Actually, you've remembered most of it. We check again in, say March. Oh, you've forgotten a little bit. We correct again, etc. That's a far more realistic view of what learning looks like, and space practice is a big part of that. And it's all too easy to give students and parents this impression that, we studied this bit of knowledge or the skill, and then we did a topic test, and you got this score on it, you got this grade, so now you understand this, and we move on to the next thing. But realistically, that isn't what learning looks like. There is a need to be space practiced, and I think depending obviously on your students and your environment and how old they are, but a lot of this often can take place outside of the school walls. Homeworks can be a great opportunity to engage in things like space practice, providing you've then got the chance to provide the corrective knowledge if they're not able to do it, if they're not remembering it. That needs to happen in some forms. But I think increasingly we are seeing with the growing use of technology, etc. A lot of this is not necessarily dependent on having to happen within a single lesson. They are opportunities, and indeed I'd say that's often something as teachers we see firsthand, is where we see students making strong progress is often when they engage in that kind of work outside of lessons, where they are continually checking to see whether they remembered something 6 months ago, 3 months ago, 2 months ago, that they're already engaged in that practice independently.
We've covered quite a lot of ideas that teachers can implement into their practice here. What would you say are the top 2 or 3 messages that you would want listeners to go away remembering?
So I think the first one would be just don't be afraid to explain why you are doing something, and that might be to parents, that might be to students, it can be to other staff, and it can be to senior leadership, depending on the role you're in. And particularly if it's something you're doing that you think is new, or it's a big change in policy, what are your reasonings? What is the theory behind it? And share that knowledge. Explain to people the underpinning justification for why you think this is probably going to improve things within your context. And likewise, it's sort of sharing that knowledge of what assessment looks like within your subject, within your class. What are the kind of different assessment activities your students are going to be? How do you do formative assessments? I think that's often really useful for students and for parents to know and to have an understanding of, and ultimately does help them feel connected and part of your educational setting. And then the second one I'd probably give is this idea, and there's a lot of it's discussed at the moment. It's very topical, but it is the concept of lifelong learning, and it is fair to say it is a very quickly changing world at the moment. It's a very uncertain world. I would not like to make predictions, but I think it's reasonably likely that a lot of our students will probably have either multiple professions within their lives, or that the professions they're doing are likely to change whilst they're within those professions in quite substantial manners. And I don't think it's realistically possible for schools or any educational setting to teach students everything they need to know for jobs that could be very different 20 or 30 years down the line, or jobs that may not really be around at the moment. And so instead, if we accept that that's probably something that we can't do as educational institutions, what we need to do instead is kind of help our students be lifelong learners, and recognize that often as they're older, a lot of this learning will be independent or semi-independent. It won't necessarily be within formal educational institutions. And I would say that if you're going to be a lifelong learner, you need to be capable of independently self-assessing. So there is that need for assessment literacy for students to be able to engage in this learning later in life. To be able to ask themselves questions such as, how do I know if I now understand something? How do I know to what extent I understand something? How good I am at something? What should my next steps going to be? I think those are really powerful tools we can give to our students, and ultimately the best way of giving them those tools is helping them to develop them within the areas we're teaching them at the moment.
Do you think that assessment literacy becomes more urgent in the world that we're living in now?
Yeah, I think education is becoming more and more important rather than less and less important. So yeah, I think again, with the increasing rate of change, but I think over the next 10, 20, 30 years there will continue to be a lot of discussions about assessments. There's going to be growing use of e-assessment. That's looking very likely, for example. And yeah, I think the more people who are involved in these kind of discussions, the better, and assessment literacy is a big part of that.
Well, as in your previous experience, James, you've presented us with some compelling and insightful ideas here that gives us loads to chew over. So thank you so much for dropping by and sharing your wisdom once again. We love to hear listener thoughts on the themes that we discuss. Why not drop us a line on assessment@twinkl.co.uk? Please like and subscribe to the podcast. You can find me on Blue Sky and LinkedIn under Sam Denno. Is there anywhere people can go looking for you, James?
Yep, you can find me on LinkedIn under James Beadle, and you can also find the Assessment Network, the organisation I work for, on LinkedIn, and you can also find them on X, and indeed we have a website as well.
As always, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody, and goodbye for now.